The following presentation is brought to you by the Realm Network.
Today on Mr. Media, I'll talk to Mark Proct, the author of Home Today, Gone Tomorrow, snapshots from 40 years on the road, Austin and back. If you love the rock and roll, you won't want to miss hearing Proct's stories of being on the road with Willie Nelson, Stevie Ray Vaughan and Double Trouble, Stevie's brother, Jimmie Vaughan and the Fabulous Thunderbirds, Delbert McClinton, Carlos Santana, and more. Stick around, because if this interview is rockin', well, go ahead and let yourself and your friends in through the screen door and pour yourself a cold one while you're at it. So much media, so little time. Who keeps track of it all? That would be me. This is Bob Andelman, and this is the Mr. Media Interview, brought to you today by Amazon.com. When you visit MrMedia.com and click on any of the links to purchase books, music, movies, gift certificates, or anything else through our Amazon link, you support this free video podcast. Whenever you need something else from Amazon, please consider returning to MrMedia.com to order it. It doesn't cost you any extra, and we sure appreciate the support. And don't forget, MrMedia.com has more than 1,200 celebrity audio and video interviews archived on the site. That's hundreds upon hundreds of hours free entertainment. Subscribe for free on MrMedia.com and you'll instantly get an email every time a new interview is posted. You can also watch and subscribe to the show on YouTube, Vimeo, Dailymotion, the Realm Network, and Frequency.com. And if you prefer to just listen, Mr. Media is also available for free on iTunes, Spreaker, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Blueberry, TuneIn, Blog Talk Radio, Podfeed.net, and Player FM. You can subscribe to any of those services and never miss another episode. Finally, you can interact with Mr. Media Interviews on all kinds of social media, including Facebook, Twitter, Google+, and more. Friend or follow us, we'll friend or follow you back. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Mr. Media is recorded live before a studio audience full of Stevie Ray Vaughan fans who will always wonder why he never bought a fancy new guitar to replace that beat-up old one he couldn't live without in the new media capital of the world, St. Petersburg, Florida. The first time I saw Stevie Ray Vaughan live in concert, he was close enough to reach out and touch. Literally. Vaughan and Double Trouble were playing at a long-gone Clearwater, Florida night spot, Mr. T's Club 19 in the mid-1980s. It was next to the also long-gone Peaches Records and Tapes. I think the site is a Sam's Club now, naturally. Anyway, I was sitting at the cool kids table. Tampa Tribune rock critic David Okamoto was there, as were Bill Templeton and Eric Snyder, editors of the local music mag called, cleverly, Music. I was covering the show for the St. Petersburg Times. All of us had heard of the blistering blues guitarists from Texas, and we all wanted to see what the fuss was about in person. It took about 10 seconds, no more, no less, to know Stevie Ray was the genuine article. Now today, I'm excited to welcome a guest who may well have been at that gig, too, longtime Stevie Ray Vaughan and Fabulous Thunderbirds tour manager Mark Proct. Proct has just published a collection of snapshots from his 4 decades on the road with many Austin, Texas-based musicians, including Willie Nelson, Jerry Jeff Walker, Delbert McClinton, Carlos Santana, probably not from Austin, but you get the idea, Jimmie Vaughan and the Fabulous Thunderbirds, and of course Stevie Ray Vaughan and Double Trouble. And incidentally, Mark pointed out to me that we are recording this on August 27th, 2015, which is, shockingly, the 25th anniversary of the plane crash that took the life of Stevie Ray Vaughan. Now, Mark's book is heavy on photos and light on stories, but I'm told that he has the gift of gab, so we're going to put him to the test. Mark Proct, welcome to Mr. Media.
Thank you. It's good to be here today.
Nice to have you. And let's start with something really important, like how a good New York boy like yourself wound up in Austin, Texas.
That is a good question. And I actually came to Austin in 1974 to visit a friend who was a musician. And it was just, we were going to be about a 4-week trip. And having grown up in and around New York and New York City, Austin was a big change. And it only took about 4 weeks to realize this was a great place to be. What I called it was Austin was students, musicians, and politicians, because it was the capital. There wasn't much growth here at the time, but it was a great city. And I decided I wanted to come back, and this is where I wanted to make my home. So about 6 months later, I packed everything I had up, got in a '67 Pontiac, and drove back to Austin. And here I am. I'm still here.
Was it as weird then as people like to say it is now?
It was very weird, and much weirder back then, but it was fun. It was a very laid back city with a great music scene. So much was happening. I came into Austin when it was called the Cosmic Cowboy, the progressive cowboy scene, and that's what kind of drew me here. I was one of only a handful of people listening to hardcore country music in New York in high school and college, listening to Willie Nelson and Waylon Jennings, and got down to Austin, and of course the Armadillo was going on. It was a bit of the club scene was great, and the musicianship was just amazing. And the Cosmic Cowboy or progressive country scene lasted about 4 or 5 years at its height here in Austin, and then it just kind of somewhat disintegrated, kind of imploded, and out of the progressive country scene became the blues scene. But it was a little bit foreign for me because here I was a serious New Yorker with a heavy New York accent back then, had fairly long hair, and right away when I got here, the first job I went and did is became a sound engineer on the tech crew for Willie Nelson. And I still remember getting in the truck, and the first 5 or 6 shows were Amarillo, Lubbock, Wichita Falls, something like that in that order. And I'd never been to West Texas before. And there was some serious rednecks and serious country. And fortunately, I had a couple of people on Willie's crew that were about 6'2", 6'3", and they kind of watched my back all the time, so I didn't get in too much trouble.
I would think a New Yorker like yourself would stick out like a sore thumb. And I saw the picture. You had big hair too, didn't you?
Absolutely. I had long hair at the time. And like I said, I lost my New York accent after 40 years. But back then, it was pretty obvious that people could tell where I was from. And there weren't that many. To be honest, there weren't that many New Yorkers roaming around Texas back in even the '70s.
And so you worked. You basically worked sound. That was your way into the business, right?
Yeah, I started out actually as a pedal steel guitar player, but when I got to Austin, I had friends who were here, musicians, but I came to the realization that I wasn't the greatest musician. And if I wanted to stay in the music business, which was my first love, it wasn't about the money. I loved Austin, but I had already decided that I wanted music to be my future. And I had studied electronics back in New York, actually up in Massachusetts. And I guess I wasn't destined to be an electrical engineer, but that was the direction I was going. But I was things and live sound. And I had the opportunity, a friend of mine kind of got me the job working for the sound company that was providing sound reinforcement for Willie Nelson. And that was basically his first big tour coming out of Texas. He had settled in Austin. And he really had just started to tour, and the future was kind of going to bring his first major U.S. tour, which I was fortunate enough to be a part of. And the gigs around Texas were kind of going from honky-tonks to theaters, and then eventually we were doing arenas. So it was an interesting time.
And you were there for the first Willie Nelson's 4th of July barbecue concert.
No, that wasn't the first one, but the one I was a part of and provided sound was Gonzales, Texas, which was pretty crazy. It was, I think they said, well over 100,000 people in a field. And if you look at the standard of today's big festivals, where there's food and vendors and water and bathrooms, there were none of that. There were none of those there. It was kind of a scary sight. I think a couple of people got killed, and it was amazing that it wasn't any more of a disaster than it turned out to be. And I talked to a couple of people that were there. A friend of mine who was a doctor had worked on site, and they were just terrified of what could happen or what might happen. But there's a great story. The show went on for almost 2 days. And at the very end, when Willie was playing, the skies just opened up and it started raining. And by the time his set was over, the roof itself had filled up with water, and it was really a very serious situation. Some of the trusses were starting to bend up on the stage, and we stopped the show for a minute. And Willie's drummer, Paul English, who's very notorious, steps up and takes a gun out of a bag, and he puts about 5 bullet holes through the roof, and all the water drains off, and that's how the picnic ended in Gonzales.
And how else should a picnic in Gonzales, Texas end, but with gunfire?
That's true.
I want to get to Stevie Ray and Jimmie in a minute, but I got to ask you, what was what kind of glimpse did you get into the life of Willie at the time? What was it like being around him in the mid-70s?
Well, my role was much different because I was a sound engineer. Of course, later on, I started to be a tour manager and a manager, and of course, got much closer to the bands. But Willie, it was a much more informal time. People hadn't really discovered him. He wasn't, of course, he was wonderful. He was amazing talent, but he wasn't as legendary as he is now. So everything was less formal. Traveling down the road, the shows themselves, and it was a wilder time. Let me tell you, he was younger. As were the band, and there were very few limits in regard to how things went on the road. So I can remember some pretty crazy times, and out of that whole era, that was the outlaw country movement was just kind of coming to be, and that was Willie Nelson and Waylon Jennings. When I was working for him, Red-Headed Stranger had just come out, which was a huge record, and the Outlaw record had been released, and nobody saw what was going to come next. And of course, it just grew exponentially. And but it was great to be around around to hear Willie do all the songs that he was doing back then. The sets, you never knew what would come next. Willie was one of those performers where I don't think there was a set list. He just called the song as he decided to play it. And it was great to be around all those other performers doing shows with Waylon Jennings, Dolly Parton, Johnny Paycheck. We just did some amazing shows. George Jones. So I got to see so many incredibly talented country musicians who just aren't around. Some who aren't around anymore.
And so you worked with Willie. You went on to work with Jerry Jeff Walker, Sleep at the Wheel, Delbert McClinton. And with all due respect to those guys, I want to get to I think what's kind of the main event, especially today, is how did you get connected first with I guess Jimmie Vaughan and the Fabulous Thunderbirds, and how did you kind of bridge from being working in sound to where they're calling you at one point to be a tour manager?
Right. Well, it was kind of the trend. Delbert sound engineer, and Delbert was people thought musician. He should be a country musician, and of course he was a blue-eyed soul singer and an amazing blues singer, and I didn't really know that much about the blues at the time, and of course that was my kind of internship into kind of getting to know blues music a lot better. Of course, Delbert was as good as they get in that regard. So, in fact, while I was on the road with Delbert, it's where I met Stevie. We played Birmingham, Alabama, and I'm maybe 1979 to 1980, and Stevie was the opening act. And he was still in Triple Threat with Luann Barton, and we got introduced and chatted with him for a while, and that was the first time I met Stevie. I went back on the road and stayed on the road with Delbert for a couple of years, and at one point he just decided he wasn't going to tour. He was going to take a break from the music, and he kind of notified the band and the crew that if we had something better to do, we should maybe choose to do it. And he didn't know when he was going to come back out and start working again. At that point, Jimmie Vaughan, Austin's a very small musical community, kind of know each other. And Jimmie had been calling me at least twice before to ask me to come to work for the Thunderbirds. And they were a ragtag group in Austin. I used to go to see them at Antone's, and their gear would be just in these, basically almost in garbage bags, and hardly had cases. And I was like, I don't want to go to work for this bunch. It kind of scares me. I was trying to kind of move upwards. I was trying to get up on the arena tours at the time. But when Delbert stopped working, a friend of mine had gone to work for the Thunderbirds as their sound engineer, and he called me up and he said, "Look, we're looking for a tour manager." Now, I had never done that before. And are you interested? And he said, we're going to Europe in about 6 months. And, that was going to be about a 6-week tour. I'd never been to Europe at the time. and I really wanted to go see Europe really badly. And I thought to myself, I said, I'm a fairly organized person. I've been watching tour managers now for the last 5 or 6 years, so I could probably do this. So I went and met with Jimmie Vaughan and Kim Wilson in the band, and was hired as a tour manager. And I came on board in 1982 when I started working for them, and just it worked out really well, and it just kind of moved forward from there.
It's funny, as you were talking about that, I'm remembering last year, maybe it was earlier this year, I had a fellow named Robert Greenfield on, who was a writer for Rolling Stone, and covered the Rolling Stones band for a while, and followed them in Europe, and talked about how difficult it was for the Stones to be touring in Europe at a point when they were kind of playing mid-sized clubs, I guess, 70s or I want to say sometime in the 70s, and how difficult it was for them. And they're the Rolling Stones, and they have a UK or European-based tour manager, and they had trouble. So when I read in your book and you were talking about, well, I just thought, yeah, I'm confident, and I've seen tour managers work. I could go to Europe where I've never been before and be a tour manager. I'm thinking, oh, you had to have a lot of confidence to pull that off.
I just took the bull by the horns, because first, there wasn't a euro, so you had a different currency in every country. Secondly, our crew, and I had some help from somebody who later became a very good friend. He was from the UK, but the 2 crew members were in a little cargo van, and I drove the 4 band members in a little passenger van, and drove them all across Europe, starting from the UK and getting on ferries and going across the North Sea, all through Scandinavia, dropping back.
And you had never been there before.
And never had seen any of it. And you think about it, it didn't speak, a lick of any of the other languages. People were very friendly, and the fans were great. We met some wonderful people. And we were in, it was January, so I can't tell you how cold it was. It was absolutely freezing. We ended up getting up in Finland about 25 miles from the Arctic Circle, and I think people were coming to our sleds. That's how cold it was. But they loved the band over there. They loved Texas blues, and at that time, Doug Somm was really very popular up in that area. And as far as the Thunderbirds went, I mean, we had a much bigger and a more accepted audience up there in Scandinavia, and then across Holland and Belgium and Germany. And we would ultimately go back over there many, many, many times. So it was a learning experience. But you're right. And I always laughed about that. When the Rolling Stones or whoever, a band like that went on the road, they had somebody do every little bit, every piece for them. And for us, I had to take care of everything for the band.
I can't imagine. And so you're getting to know the band at the same time you're getting to know Europe, you're getting to know the currencies, you're getting to know the hotels, the transportation. Everything is new to you, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
You got balls, my friend. You have gigantic.
Plus, I had to babysit 4 crazy musicians. Well, 3, and 1, the drummer, Franny Christina, was level-headed. But you have to remember, this is well before sobriety, was part of the plan. So I had a band that could have been as wild as the Rolling Stones or Led Zeppelin in their own way. I had to make sure, everybody was taken care of and keep them on the right path as best as I could.
Now, where were the T-Birds in their evolution at that point? Had they had any big hits yet? Was that before?
Not at all. I came on board while they were recording the last record for Chrysalis with Nick Lowe. Nick was the producer, and I came into the studio while they were making that record. And it's a funny story because they recorded at a full production studio in Austin that ran television and media commercials during the day. And they were nice enough to let the band record during the night when nobody else was there. So the sessions would start after the clubs would close in Austin, and they were at Antone's till 1 or 2 o'clock, and then everybody would gather at the studio and they record 2 o'clock in the morning till 6 or 7 until the day the day crew came in to start cutting commercials or doing whatever they do. So that was it was a great record, but the Nick Lowe produced record, T-Bird Rhythm. But literally the 2 weeks after it came out, Chrysalis got, I believe, bought by CBS Records, and they dropped the T-Birds, and the record went away as fast as it came out. It was gone. So the Fabulous Thunderbirds at that point were like everybody's favorite club band. You know, at that point, the Rolling Stones had asked them, and they had played a couple of shows at Cotton Bowl with them, and they did with Clapton. You know, Eric had them come out and do a tour, and like I said, their shows were amazing. I mean, the energy, and most of the the higher musicianship loved the band, but the average person and radio hadn't even come close to discovering them. And they were going to this point where just, a grind for touring, day in, day out. We would go out for 4, 5, 6 weeks, come home for maybe a week, and then we'd get back on the bus and we'd go back out again for 4, 5, 6 more weeks. And we never really could take a break because it was the only way we could afford to make a living and keep the bills paid.
Right, because there was no record income.
No other income at all. It was just it was fortunate enough because as things have changed in 2015, back in those days there was a club scene that was really good if you could kind of get on it and do well, and you could play. Back in the day, when the Lone Star opened in New York City, it was a great place to go and play 2 or 3 nights. Of course, there were Washington D.C. all up and down the East Coast. There were great venues in the South, and it's a little harder, I think, for bands to accomplish that today. But we, being the Fabulous Thunderbirds and Stevie Ray, before he hit, he was out in his white step van doing the same circuit. Delbert McClinton was doing the same thing. Los Lobos was starting from the West Coast. So the Nighthawks were the East Coast band, and everybody was making a living. But again, radio had never really accepted any of those bands, even rock radio, for certain, when there was a rock radio. So we were all on our own. It was up to us to figure out how to make ends meet.
And so tell me, because we want to take advantage of your access, your backstage access. Tell us a little bit about the guys in the T-Birds touring Europe or after that. What were they like? What was the interaction? Did they all? I mean, there was a point at which Keith Ferguson was replaced, right? Where does that fit into the?
There was a transition about 1984 when Keith just was pretty tired of being on the road. It was an incredibly difficult decision for the band to make, and for Jimmie. I believe Jimmie and Kim went over and talked to Keith, but he had some issues. I mean, it's no secret, with drugs and alcohol, and the road wasn't the right place for him to be. The band also had made a decision that it was really time to get very serious about where they were going, and try to take things from being just a club band to trying to elevate to the next level. And I don't think, to be honest, I don't think really Keith could have handled it out there with the band much longer. And I think he knew that too. He had accepted that. On the other hand, one of the things we had figured out in 83, 84 was that Europe was a better market for the band. And we were starting to play these festivals, blues festivals, and make more money in the European market than we were making in the U.S. market. So we were finding ourselves getting on a plane and maybe going over to London or to Europe for 2 or 3 days, maybe longer, 4 or 5, whatever it took. But when the tour was done, we were making much more money as an organization than we were just kind of beating it out on the bus, playing for, in the club circuit here in the United States. And that's kind of another discussion, but people accepted music over there much easier than they did in the United States. Radio is so behind over here at the time, and over there people didn't build up those walls between blues and rock and pop music. So there were big festivals over there that they were happy to have the Fabulous Thunderbirds come over and play on. And we thought about actually relocating to the UK at one point. We were going to, put a set of equipment over there in storage, and we were to kind of, like I said, kind of base ourselves out of London until things changed dramatically. Maybe the next part of this whole story is when the Thunderbirds, prior to recording Tough Enough, but when Tough Enough was made, and where things took them into the late '80s.
Well, I mean, we should probably go to that, because then there is this big change. I mean, and by the way, the time that you were talking about, New Age is very big here, and then gradually it becomes heavy metal becomes very big, but the blues just didn't seem to fit with the U.S. scene. So, but somehow the band hits on Tough Enough. What changed? Did they change? Did the market change? And how is it affecting them? Behind the scenes.
It's an inch. Well, first, I'm going to back up a minute to your question, because it was a wild bunch of guys out on the road, doing a lot of just being wild and crazy back in the '80s.
What does that mean? Help people out there.
Well, there was a lot of
drugs. They don't know what wild and crazy means from your perspective.
There was a lot of alcohol and drugs and drinking, and the whole point was just going out and playing the best show you could play. And there were lots of friends backstage. There were people that loved the band. The responsibilities didn't really, for the band, go beyond that, because they just got themselves ready. They played their butts off, their hearts out on that stage for 2.5 hours, and you're out on the road. It's difficult. You got to rely on the friends you meet. It's not easy. Everybody thinks, it's a life of luxury out there, and it's not. Getting on that bus and getting to the next show, and we didn't have the luxury also of playing like 3 nights a week and having a lot of days off. We would play 7 nights a week if they could book the band 7 nights a week. We'd probably average 6 nights a week, and we were lucky to barely get a day off. So it was a gruel. It was a gruel on the road, and but we loved it. I won't say that. I don't regret one moment of it. So but the touring just kept on going.
And tell people, we should stop here. Tell people what a tour manager does, because you're right there with the band the whole time, right? I mean, you're not playing on stage with them, but other than that, you're inseparable, right?
Oh yeah. At that point, and prior to the internet and other things that are accessible to you, you're taking care of everything. I mean, at that point, obviously, took care of the band day to day, coordination of the show, advancing the show, even booking the hotel. Making sure I actually drove the bus at that time because we couldn't afford a bus driver. So 3 of us shared the bus driving duties, collected the money, making sure you got paid, taking care of the band, keeping them out of jail. And you're basically their, a little bit of their mother and father, because they rely on you for everything as a tour manager. And they got to respect you. You've got to keep yourself, the level of responsibility fairly high, because it's all going to fall back on you. So if something happens at the hotel, somebody's getting ready to get arrested, or there's a fight, your phone is going to ring at 3, 4, 5 o'clock in the morning. And it had plenty of times for me rang at that time. And you got to be the one to go take care of business. And get everything right. You got to get them out of bed the next day, and if that means going to the room and getting the room key and helping them get dressed and get back on the bus, that's whatever it took to get to the next show.
All right, so who was the easiest to manage this way, and who was the toughest? They're never going to hear this. This is just between you and me. No one will ever hear this.
Yeah.
Who was toughest on the road from the T-Birds, and who was the easiest to manage?
Well, for the Thunderbirds, the easiest one was Fran Christina, the drummer, because Franny was a businessman, and he understood what was going on. You could rely on Fran to be the responsible party. Kim and Jimmie were about a tie, because they take turns getting in trouble. So that was my problem, is I couldn't take a day off. So let's say one night Kim got out of control. Jimmie would be reasonable, maybe sleeping in his bunk. And the next day, Kim would be sleeping off his night before. And then Jimmie would go off. So it was never a day off for me, though.
Wow. All right, so let's skip ahead a little bit. When does Stevie Ray Vaughan and Double Trouble, when do they get involved? When do you get involved with them professionally?
Right.
How does that happen?
Well, When Stevie went off, I still remember the time about the time he went off to California to record Texas Flood. At the point we were friends, or friendlier. I knew his crew, and his sound engineer was actually a friend from Austin, Richard Mullins, and they went off, and I knew they were going to Jackson Brown's studio, and they recorded Texas Flood, and of course they'd gotten signed through CBS. To CBS Records through John Hammond. And there were very few people that really believed that Stevie could sell a record. You know, how is a blues guitar player ever going to get played on radio? But he did have some fans out there within the business. And Stevie came back out and they released a record. And of course, kind of the rest is history. But he ultimately opened up the boundaries at rock radio because he was one of the first true rock blues artists to start getting airplay, getting acceptance, and obviously starting a successful career. So prior to the second album, Couldn't Stand the Weather, they had being released, went to Hawaii to play at the CBS Records convention. And I went over with him. He brought Jimmie over to play as kind of a second guitar because Couldn't Stand the Weather. The second album was a little bit more complicated in regard to some of the musicianship on it. And he had added Jimmie had played a few parts on the record. And anyway, we went over to Hawaii for the convention. And Stevie was looking for a tour manager to come back on the road after that convention was finished. And T-Bird's actually taken some time off to reorganize and kind of get settled back up again. And so I went out on the road for, about 6 weeks when we did return back to USA. And it was the start of the Couldn't Stand the Weather tour. And I went to work for Stevie, like I said, as the tour manager. And he was, like I said, we did that 6 week tour. And I had to go back to the T-Birds because it was kind of there was a little sibling rivalry going on. And I think Stevie kind of liked that I kind of left the T-Birds for a period of time and came to work for Stevie Ray and Double Trouble. But, Jimmie would definitely wanted me to come back and not just bail on them. And, of course, as I look back, I kind of am glad I kind of ended up back in the T-Birds camp. So,
why do you say that?
Well, because ultimately I became the Fabulous Thunderbirds manager from tour manager and led them into Tough Enough. And, of course, we were ultimately able to really blow the door open with the things we accomplished with Tough Enough. And I certainly, I love Stevie. The thing about Stevie, he was the most intense musician I'd ever met. And from the first time I saw him play, he had that fire in his eyes. And he wanted to be successful. I mean, he stepped out on the stage, and whether there were 3 people, 30 people, 300 people, he'd want to make them all fans by the time they left the club. And, he knew he wanted to kind of climb to much bigger and better things. He wanted to be on that stage at Madison Square Garden. And he loved the music, and he loved the idea of him being able to reach people through that music.
My sense is that Jimmie and Stevie were competitive yet very supportive of each other, I'm just guessing here that Jimmie was more extroverted of the pair, and that Stevie the more introverted. Am I anywhere close on this? No,
actually, it's kind of the opposite, because Stevie was the outgoing person who, career-wise, was talking to the press, talking to the fans. And that's what happens. He had made the jump to becoming a solo artist. When you're in a band, and not just the Fabulous Thunderbirds, but say specifically the Thunderbirds, you've got 4 other guys you can rely on. So you don't have to take all that responsibility on your shoulders. For the T-Birds, it's kind of like a dual frontman. Kim was up there singing and talking, but everybody kind of knew who Jimmie Vaughan was. But the responsibility, the brunt of it, didn't land on Jimmie's shoulders. And I think he liked that. And the brothers had a sibling rivalry. Jimmie was the older brother. Stevie looked up to his brother. And it was a little tough because Stevie broke out first. And his success came while the T-Birds were still struggling. And it would be a lie not to say that, Jimmie probably was a little, somewhat jealous of his brother's success at the time. But I don't think Stevie wanted his brother to succeed probably more than anybody.
And did you have much contact with the rest of the family?
Yes, I spent quite a bit of time up in Oak Cliff, around obviously before his dad passed away, and his dad was a tough guy. He had he was a disciplined disciplined him pretty hard, and and Big Jim, he didn't say much, he didn't talk very much, and sometimes I say Jimmie was a little bit more like his dad, I guess, and Stevie was like his mom. And Martha Vaughan was just a wonderful person. She was the sweetest person you could ever meet. We were all welcome to them up there, and every time in Dallas, we spend time in Oak for sure.
So tell me, we mentioned at the top of the show that today is unfortunately kind of a sad anniversary. It's 25th anniversary. We're recording this again, I'll mention again, August 27th, 2015. You mentioned to me that today is the 25th anniversary of losing Stevie. I got to ask, do you remember, where you were and how you found out?
Oh, I know exactly where I was because I was on the next helicopter in Alpine Valley. I'd gone up there with Jimmie and Stevie. We had just completed Family Style. I mean, it was an incredibly happy time because we had just had a listening party with Sony Records in Dallas. And this gig was booked well in advance this weekend with Clapton, and Jim, great to up there to Alpine Valley, see Eric, and Stevie had rekindled not rekindled but strengthened their relationship as brothers, having recorded Family Style and been in the studio together, and were just looking so forward to the future. And so we all went up together to Alpine Valley. We were staying in Chicago, and it was decided that the best way to get back and forth would be via the helicopters. And Clapton was doing the same thing, him and his crew and organization. And of course, the night before, everything just went very smoothly. I mean, there was no problem. We flew up there. The show was great. That was a Saturday night, and came back to Chicago. And I think we actually went to Legends and to Buddy Guy's Club that night. And the next day, Sunday, we repeated what we had done the day before and got on the helicopters and went back up to Alpine Valley. And the show was just brilliant. I mean, it was amazing. The encore, I mean, people still talk about it. What happened was there were 4 helicopters, and we had a choice. If you left before Eric was done, then they would run a helicopter or 2 back to Chicago, and some of the crew and some of Stevie's crew and some of the people went down early on. But because most everybody stayed for the encore, Jimmie and Stevie and Chris and Tommy, we would have had to wait for the helicopters to take Eric's group back to Chicago, come back to Alpine Valley, which wasn't a really long trip, and they would take the rest of us bound. So the show's over, and everybody was doing their hellos and goodbyes and doing this and that. And somebody, Eric was getting ready they were boarding the helicopters, and somebody came back up to the dressing room and just said there was an extra seat on that 4th helicopter, and Stevie was welcome to it. And he wanted to get back to Chicago, and he wanted to take care of some personal things. And he was bothered by it because he didn't necessarily want to leave his brother in the band up there. And I know he went back to Jimmie and asked him if it was okay. And everybody, basically, no problem. I mean, we'll just wait a little longer. And at that point, there was a fog rolling in, and it was backstage. You could start it was getting difficult to see in front of you. But Stevie went down to the helicopter, and as far as we knew, all the helicopters took off one after the other. And as 30 or 40 minutes went by, the fog got a lot worse back there to the point where you couldn't see anything. And so we're waiting. It's maybe an hour and a half. Really difficult to remember exactly how much time went by. But it finally came to us and said, look, they're not going to be able to land the helicopters back here because of the fog, but we're going to put you in a couple of vans and take you out to another place where they can land, and they'll pick you up and take you back to Chicago. So we get in these vans, and we drove 45, 50 minutes. And, of course, the helicopters came on board. The helicopters landed, and we got on board. And I was sitting up front with the pilot, and I put the headsets on. And I didn't know this till well after the fact, but they were talking about, but they were talking and using code because at that point one of the helicopters they didn't locate, but they wouldn't say anything because they didn't know if it had just landed in a field, if it had mechanical problems. And we just went back to Chicago. They dropped us off, and nobody said a word. And of course, the next morning, I got a call from Jimmie, and Jimmie told me what had happened. And that's where everything went crazy after that.
It's amazing that you didn't know until the next morning with everything going on.
It wasn't until the fog actually cleared and they realized what had happened, and that the helicopter, for some reason, 3 of the helicopters went left and straight out the path, and this one helicopter pilot went right, and he hit the hill, and it's tragedy,
And we should, of course, be respectful that obviously Jimmie was on that helicopter, but there was a pilot and 3 other people.
Yes, and there was another. I had another friend on, one of the agents from CAA was on the other helicopter, and Eric's 2 crew and the pilot. Yes, and people have said that. And it's important to know that losing Stevie was a loss, but losing everybody that on the helicopter was a terrible tragedy and a loss.
Do you remember anything from that day after you heard what happened? And you probably had a role to play because you had this job. You probably had to do a lot of things that you weren't planning to do, and that maybe, I don't know. Tell me about that day.
Well, it was chaotic because we met in Eric's, and obviously it was Eric had a lot to deal with because it was his crew members, and the agent Bobby Brooks, I should say, Bobby was a friend at CAA, and just nobody knew who was on the helicopters. I mean, when the news hit, people thought it was Jimmie. I had family members of my own thinking I might have been on it. There was just no confirmation. But next morning, early on, we were in, Eric's manager, Eric, Jimmie, and myself kind of just, started to try to figure out what needed to be done. And the first thing is Jimmie and I got in a car, and we went straight back up to Alpine Valley. It was important. That's, what needed to be done. It was just an incredibly long drive. Some things like, you're just in a kind of in a confused state and hard to believe what's happened and not sure what you're going to see. So the first thing is went back to Alpine Valley, and the AA were already there on site, and they were actually they were very nice to Jimmie. He wanted to go and see, to be honest, he wanted to see the site. And we did go back up to the hill, and I'm going to tell the story because it's kind of an amazing part of this. And Jimmie was looking for Stevie's cross because they couldn't tell. He wore that cross all the time, and so we were looking, and we were there for a while and couldn't find it, and just figured, well, maybe it will, it'll be found at some point. So we go to leave there. And a guy was running up to the car we're in, and this is amazing. And he in this field found the cross and handed it to Jimmie, and it was just I'm still just an incredible thing to happen. So and then by that point, of course, word was out back in Austin. There was a lot of grieving going on everywhere. And it was just a matter of things had to be taken care of. So it just tried to get out of that funk and start to think about what needed to be done.
It's just incredible. And, of course, there have been a couple other, in the history of rock and roll, there have been some other famous plane mishaps and flying mishaps. And, I'm sure no one ever sees it coming. Otherwise, you wouldn't get in a plane or a helicopter. And it was August, right, in Chicago. So, who would think?
Right, and that's an interesting venue. Is kind of man-made ski resort, and so the hills are there, and because it sits in those rolling hills, they said the fog will just roll in, and like I said, we went 30 or 40 minutes away, and it was literally absolutely clear, not a sign that there was any type of fog there. So, and we were also we all thought at that point we were veterans and old at what we were doing. And now we look back and go, Stevie and I were the same age, so we were 35 at the time. And now I realize how young he was and how much more he was getting ready to accomplish. He obviously had done so much up to that time, but there was so much more to come. So you just never know what life's going to bring you.
And how did the tragedy affect Jimmie and the Thunderbirds? Obviously, Double Trouble, it changed a lot of lives that day.
Absolutely. Well, prior to that, Jimmie in '89, that's when he quit the Fabulous Thunderbirds. And that's when him and Stevie had grown tighter together, grown closer on the road. We were touring together, the two bands, '88 and '89, a lot of dates together. And they spent a lot of time talking about this, about getting together and making a record. And it's another interesting story. We got time, but Sony Records wanted a Vaughan Brothers record very badly, and the record company didn't really have a working relationship with either brother, and there was no A&R person assigned. John Hammond wasn't there; he was the one that signed Stevie, and so they came to me and they said, "You got to help us make this record happen." So I would talk to Jimmie about it. This was '89, and Stevie, and they both wanted to do this. So at the end of '89, it was decided that Jimmie had quit the T-Birds to pursue recording, what we didn't know at the time, but Family Style. And but somebody had to jump out there and start to make it happen, because Stevie only had a short window. He was still touring, and a big part of his world was touring. So I was told, okay, this is the time you can go make the record. So the first thing was trying to find a producer, and I looked at Don Was, who was a very influential producer at the time, but Don's schedule was booked for the next 2 years. Thought about Billy Gibbons, but couldn't get to his camp to make it work. And Nile Rodgers was the other name, and Stevie had worked with Nile on the David Bowie record. And Jimmie and I had talked about Nile over the years. He really liked Nile's style, his songwriting, and obviously his production work. So I got a contact in New York and got a hold of Nile Rodgers, and Nile thought it was a great idea. And Jimmie, Steve, and I, we flew to New York. I believe it was the early part of January of 1990, and we met with Nile in the studio. He was doing some recording up there, and he loved it. He said, "I'm in. I want to make this record. This would be great." And he said, "Well, what songs do you have?" And Jimmie and Stevie looked at each other and they go, "Well, we really don't have any." Jimmie picked up a guitar. He had 2 or 3 kind of pieces to songs. Stevie had some ideas. So I had to basically say, "Look, we're going to start recording in March. We'll go home, and I'll guarantee you we'll have an album ready to go in the studio." And Al looked at me and said, "Okay." So we went back to Texas. Jimmie worked with an incredible songwriter, Jerry Williams, to finish some of the ideas that he had, TikTok being one of them, and a few other pieces. Stevie got together with his co-writer Doyle Bramhall, and they finished up 2 or 3, 4 of the songs that they ultimately had on the album. And we went to Memphis and we started recording, and we started with the first song that was finished. And as we were recording one song, the guys were kind of putting lyrics to the second or third song, and it just kind of turned into having a complete record. So by the time by the time June came about, Family Style was recorded and mixed and ready to go.
But it was released posthumously, though, right?
Yeah, well, there were plans. Jimmie and Stevie talked about touring together in January of '91. And I think I said before, we had a listening party with Sony in Dallas at the studio, and all the senior execs came on. Were blown away by the record because it was just so different. The whole approach. A lot of people just thought, oh, this is going to be this big guitar record, bluesy guitar record. But it was about the songs, and some of Stevie's best performances vocal-wise were on that album. And the guitar playing between the two brothers was just brilliant. And so there was just so much, just everybody was so excited about that. And of course, August came about. And at first, nobody really thought about what was going to happen. But there was a time when we had to address it. And Stevie was incredibly proud of that record, as was Jimmie. So it was decided to release it come September. And it was a tough time. I mean, some interviews, there needed to be things talked about the record. A lot of work had come about doing it, and they were very proud of it. So the record came out, and it won 2 Grammys, and it's a great collaboration between the two of them, and still one of my favorite albums. But everybody was certainly in a grieving mode at the time. Of course, Double Trouble, Chris and Tommy came back to Austin, and most of Austin was still grieving. And I was managing at the time. There's a story out of this, but I was managing Doyle Bramhall II. Young Doyle had grown up in Fort Worth around the Vaughan brothers. Of course, his dad was a part of the whole scene and been Stevie's writing partner. And Doyle was down in Austin, and I had gotten him signed to a developmental deal with Geffen Records. And at the time, Tommy Shannon, Double Trouble bass player, was playing with Doyle. And there was a rehearsal complex called the ARC, the Austin Rehearsal Complex. And Charlie Sexton had just come back from Los Angeles, another friend of all of ours. He had grown up around Jimmie and Stevie, the Vaughans, the same thing. And he was now living back in Austin, and he had a little rehearsal room there. Doyle was in another room cutting some demos. And Chris was Chris had a drum room there. So he was there, Chris Layton, most of the time. And when they got there early, they started to play together. They would just kind of start jamming. And again, there was a lot of grieving going on. Nobody knew what they really needed to do or what they should be doing. And I hate to say it, but everybody depended on Stevie quite a bit. And there was just a huge, big hole gone. And people were lost. So those guys were doing this playing and trying to keep themselves busy. In the meantime, there was a venue that was a few blocks away from the Austin Rehearsal Complex called the Austin Opera House. And a friend of mine owned the venue, and Robert Cray was coming to play there in a month or so. And I was up at the venue, and I said, "Do you have an opening act?" And he said, "No." I said, "Well, I might have an idea for you that you might really like." I ran back down the hill to the complex. The 4 guys were there, both Charlie, Chris, and Tommy. And I said, "Would you guys be interested in opening up for Robert Cray?" And they said, "Well, what kind of, what do we have to do?" I said, "Maybe 40 minutes or so." And they said, "Well, I think we could do that and get that together." So the next question was, what should we call ourselves? And they were standing outside the building, and Chris Layton looks up, and it's the Austin Rehearsal Complex, the ARC, and he goes, "How about the Archangels?" And that's where the Archangels grew out of. And of course, it was a big thing for those 4 musicians, an opportunity to create music and honor Stevie and some of that music. And I don't know if you're familiar with the Archangels. They had an album on Geffen Records that was very, very successful. Unfortunately, the band imploded and didn't last as long as they should have, but it was an incredibly talented group for the first 4 years they were together.
Well, let's bring this around full circle now, because you still have a book you want people to know about and take a look at. We've been kind of talking around a little bit, talking about the musicians that you've worked with. You shot a lot of photographs over the years. You point out with different cameras, that kind of thing. They're very intimate at times. I wondered, given your backstage and your personal access, did any of these guys, any of the performers, object to being photographed that way? I mean, a lot of these guys, they control their image very tightly from the press during shows. But I wondered if any of them said, "No, sorry, Mark, please don't take any photos." And at the same time, I wondered if you were always, discreet about it.
Well, first of all, they were all friends. Everybody I worked for, I was always considered a friend. And there was never any awkwardness of having the camera. And I knew when to take it out and when to not take it out. And I'll back up a minute. When I grew up, I carried a camera with me. And when I got to Texas, I had one of those old Kodak Instamatics, the little square camera with the Kodak with the cube on the top. And that's where the first pictures came from, the Willie Nelson pictures. And working as a sound engineer and for the sound company, didn't really have a lot of time to always take the camera out. So I was really fortunate that I took the pictures that I took. So when I did go back and think, can I document all 40 years, there were some great pictures of Willie, of Jerry Jeff, and right up to Delbert. But when I made the transition to tour manager, I was certainly closer to the band, and it was comfortable to have a camera with me, and I was obviously spending more time with the band. And I felt nobody else was documenting any of the things that I was taking pictures of, whether it was in London with Dave Edmunds recording the Fabulous Thunderbirds, Tough Enough. Ultimately, when we did record Family Style, it was only Jimmie, Stevie, myself, Renee Martinez, the guitar tech, Nile Rodgers, and then a couple other musicians. There were no press, there were no record company people there. So I thought it was really important to document what they were doing. And everybody was really comfortable. I mean, you can see there was never, somebody might tell me, it's, get the camera out of here, in jest at certain times. But 99% of the time, people, they were very comfortable with it. And I am so thankful that I did document all of those years. And, I was never kind of a professional photographer per se. But somebody told me a few weeks ago, they said, well, you weren't there on assignment. You weren't working for a magazine. That was your life. That's what you did. And so every picture that was taken is literally a long story that goes with it. But sometimes I captured a great moment. But I got to tell you, I got a book. I've got thousands more photos. Some are great and could have been in the book, and some that I wish they were better focused would have been in the book.
I understand. We've all got a million of those, don't we?
Right.
Yeah. All right. What are you doing now? What do you do these days? Are you retired?
Well, I thought I was retired for a little bit, but one of my artists that I'd worked with, and this is a great story, and I felt that I've always maintained this relationship with the groups that I had worked with. And kind of an offshoot story, the Archangels broke up in 1995 or 1996, and even we stayed friends. And then when they did get together again for a reunion and what was going to be hopefully a longer one, they called me and asked me to come back and manage them. And I felt that said a lot about the relationship we had and how we worked together. So, and when the Archangels broke up and Double Trouble, Chris and Tommy were part of another band called Storyville with a singer by the name of Malford Milligan and guitarist David Grissom and David Holt. They called me up and asked me again to come back and manage them, and got them signed to Atlantic Records. And we had a couple of albums on Atlantic, but it was short-lived again. But the singer, Malford Milligan, who is an incredible person and an amazing singer, this year's Austin Vocalist of the Year, him and I stayed friends, and he stayed here in Austin and worked on quite a few projects as I went off to do different things. And back in May of this past year, Malford called me up and he said, Mark, would you come listen to some music that we're working on? I've got a new band, and the band's called Big Cat, and would you mind checking it out? So I went to the studio, and they gave me the music to take home, and I took a CD with me. And I started listening to it, and I said, this is great. I mean, it's bluesy, and it's certainly got an edge to it. And if Storyville was this great Austin band that some people will know, and some people, if they don't know, they should go check it out. But it was a really high-energy band, and Malford was just this phenomenal frontman. And I think what he didn't have all these years was the right band as a vehicle for him to display that musicianship and that leadership. This band is Roscoe Beck on bass, and Roscoe, if you go do a little research on him, is probably one of the top bass players in the world, maybe in the top 5. A great Austin drummer by the name of Les Fisher, and a great guitar player from Austin, Dave Seabreeze, and the keyboard player, Stefano Intellisano. Stefano's from Italy and settled here in Austin, played with Jason Mraz and a long list of people. But the musicianship is phenomenal, and watch out for Big Cat. So I'm managing again.
Oh, okay, good for you.
Yeah.
All right. Well, maybe sometime we'll get Big Cat on here. We'll go ahead and extend that invitation now. We'll just take a shot at that.
I would love that.
All right. Well, folks, listen, you can find Mark Proct's collection of rock and roll history in photos Home Today, Gone Tomorrow, in great stores everywhere, or you can order it right now at a great price at MrMedia.com. And if you're regular on the show, you know how this works. Somewhere below the video, to the left or the right, you'll see the cover of the book. You can click on it, and Amazon can deliver it to you via drone in 30 minutes or less. I think that's how they work. I'm not sure. Otherwise, you can get it in a day or two. But definitely, you can just click on it. It'll bring up the opportunity to order it. Get it now. Mark, do you have a website? Are you a Twitter or Facebook guy? Can people find you online?
I'm all over the place. HometodayGoneTomorrow.net. And there's quite a bit of information on there, and there's some interviews that are interesting, more from a management standpoint. And Austin music, if you're interested in the music scene here, on Facebook you can find it through Home Today, Gone Tomorrow, or through Mark Proct. And I am on Twitter, and I've become a social media guru, I guess.
Excellent.
You have to be.
Excellent. Well, I'm delighted that we got to talk. I'm glad we got to talk about Stevie and the day. I know it's kind of a sad thing to remember, but it touched an awful lot of us. Just the coincidence that today was the day we were talking, and I didn't realize it until now. So I appreciate that. And Mark Proct, thank you so much for being a guest on Mr. Media.
Oh, it's a pleasure being here. Thank you. It's been great.
To believe her, turn up the stereo receiver.